I'm Jeremy Scahill coming to you from the offices of The Intercept in New York City, and this is a special video edition of Intercepted.
I was kind of stunned by how much information is already available to show that pretty conclusively that the Russians were behind the intervention in the 2016 election.
It's a long line now of stories about Trump and Russia that major media outlets have trumpeted in a very flamboyant way, only for those stories to completely fall apart upon minimal scrutiny, always going in the same direction of trying to prove that Trump really did collude with the Russians in a criminal way and that Russia is essentially taking over the United States.
James Risen and Glenn Greenwald have both won Pulitzer Prizes. Both of them have found themselves in the crosshairs of the national security state because of their reporting. And they both write for The Intercept. Glenn Greenwald is one of the most prominent skeptics of the official story involving Trump and Russia. He regularly blasts U.S. intelligence agencies, the Democratic Party, and large, powerful media organizations for how they've reported on this story. James Risen, under threat of imprisonment, battled both the Bush and Obama administrations for his refusal to name sources in some of the most sensitive national security reporting of the past 17 years. James Risen recently published a story detailing the NSA and CIA's secret communications channel with Russia. And his first column for The Intercept has the title, "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" Both men are going to hash this out as they go head-to-head in this special. And I'm joined right now by my two colleagues. Jim Risen is the senior national security correspondent for The Intercept, and Glenn Greenwald is my fellow co-founder of The Intercept. He's joining us from Rio de Janeiro. Welcome to you both. Jim, let's begin with you. You wrote a piece that was very provocative, has caused a lot of debate, including debate within The Intercept itself. The title of that piece was, "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" Lay out your case.
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't really written very much about the whole Trump-Russia case before. I think I was pretty agnostic about it to begin with. But I realized that there'd been so many incremental stories about it that the narrative and the case had really been lost to most people. And to me, I didn't really understand, just as a reader, how to follow these stories because they were coming out in such a kind of a chaotic, incremental way. And so I kind of dove into the available evidence. And what struck me, first of all, was the gravity of and significance of what it means potentially. Because at heart, this is a case about whether or not the President of the United States is a traitor. That obviously hasn't been proven yet. But that's what this case is about. And if you read the letter that Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, wrote, giving the mandate to Robert Mueller to investigate this, it reads a lot like the definition of treason. It's not the same, but it's similar enough that I think you could draw parallels.
Glenn Greenwald, let's bring you in here for a response. You have been confronted on Twitter and other social media platforms in the aftermath of Jim Risen's article with the provocative title of "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" And people were sort of saying, well, doesn't Glenn Greenwald read his own publication? Are you saying that Jim Risen is a liar? Your response, Glenn, to Jim and the theory and ideas that he just laid out.
So I do want to preface everything I'm about to say in light of the internet's very charming propensity to characterize every disagreement as some kind of very personalized war by observing that Jim Risen has long been and still is one of my heroes in journalism. His 2005 Pulitzer Prize story on the NSA is essentially what I spent the first year of my career in journalism working on. I think he was incredibly courageous the way he stood up to the Bush and then Obama administration's attempts to threaten him with prison if he didn't reveal his sources. I also regard him as a personal friend who was extremely supportive when I was doing the Snowden reporting, and I think I tried to be supportive to him during that ordeal. And he's a colleague of mine who, if you remember, Jeremy, he was pretty much at the very top of our list when we created The Intercept of people who we wanted to steal from other media organizations. And it took a few years for us to accomplish it, but I'm incredibly thrilled that he's at The Intercept. And obviously, Jim Risen didn't leave the New York Times to come to The Intercept to only write things that either Jeremy or I like and approve of. He came to have the thing that we created The Intercept to give all of our journalists, which is full journalistic autonomy and independence. And so obviously, not only is he free to write things that we disagree with, I'm really happy when he does, because I think that media outlets are much more vibrant when they accommodate really intense conflicts of perspective and disagreements. If we wanted to be MSNBC and only allow this kind of prevailing orthodoxy, we wouldn't have needed to create the Intercept. So having said all that, I do have a lot of disagreements with Jim on his views of the Trump-Russia story generally, and some really deep-seated objections to this article in particular, which I just want to outline briefly. So the one that I find the most objectionable is the way in which the entire article was framed, beginning with the headline, which suggested that Donald Trump might be a traitor. Jim, in his description of his article, began by acknowledging that he's not saying Trump is a traitor, because we don't know if Trump did the things he's accused of doing in terms of collusion. But Jim in the article did say that, and he said again now, that if Trump did in fact collude with the Russians, then it very well may mean that he's a traitor, which is another way of saying that someone is guilty of treason. And the sentence that I found most objectionable in the article itself was when Jim wrote, quote, "If a presidential candidate or his lieutenants secretly work with a foreign government that is a longtime adversary of the United States to manipulate and then win a presidential election, that is almost a textbook definition of treason." That is not just wrong, but dangerously wrong, that statement and that idea, that it's almost a textbook definition of treason. It's completely not a textbook definition of treason. And it's extremely important to be careful about what treason does and doesn't mean. And there was a fantastic article just from 2 days ago by Stephen Vladeck, who's a professor of law at the University of Texas, who on NBC's website wrote a really great article about why it's so dangerous to throw the word treason around recklessly in cases where it clearly doesn't apply. And he meant it in two senses. One, Trump had just said that maybe the Democrats were traitors for not standing and clapping for all of the great things that are happening to the United States. And then the other one is that Trump might be a traitor for colluding with the Russians. And what Professor Vladeck said, and he's a really ardent opponent of Trump, is he examined the history of treason in the United States. And he said, quote, "The mere existence of this question of whether Trump is a traitor underscores the need for a long overdue moratorium on the blithe characterization of things as treason, and for all of us to be far more careful when using that term to describe conduct that we believe is some combination of reprehensible, criminal, and perhaps even impeachable." As Jim acknowledges in the article, the Constitution defines treason. It's not a vague crime. It's one of the most specific crimes, and the Constitution went out of its way to define what treason is. It doesn't define what murder is, it doesn't define rape or pedophilia, but it does define treason, and it says treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And what Professor Vladeck said is that, contrary to Jim's suggestion in the article that, well, it's kind of a vague term, so we don't really know if collusion would fit into it, it's actually not vague at all. And he cited a federal appeals court in 1986 who explained, quote, "The reason for the restrictive definition of treason is apparent from the historical backdrop of the treason clause. The framers of the Constitution were reluctant to facilitate such prosecutions because they were well aware of abuses, and they themselves were traitors in the eyes of England. As a result, treason is, in some respects, the most specific crime in our legal system, and certainly among the hardest to prove." And then he went on to apply it to this question of whether Trump could be a traitor if he colluded with Russia. And what Vladeck says is, quote, "Because of this history, a lot of things that might seem or feel like treason to casual observers do not, in fact, come close. In this context, enemies, for example, must be countries against which Congress has formally declared war or otherwise authorized the use of force. So contemporary Russia is out, whatever role it might have played in the 2016 election. Even during the height of the Cold War, Vladeck writes, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried, convicted, and executed for conveying nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, the charge against them was espionage, not treason, and that's because we weren't at war with the Soviet Union. And so he concludes, by those metrics, it should be obvious why it is not treason to either refuse to applaud the president or to collude with Russia to influence the outcome of a presidential election. To be sure, the latter one is worse, but treason is a crime indicating the clear support of our enemies during wartime, period.
Yeah,
and I
think
found this framing, so I found the framing so dangerous because, for two reasons. One is, there is this attempt to suggest that Russia is our enemy with whom we're at war. And the amazing thing about that is that President Obama spent 8 years rejecting that view. During the time of the 2016 election in 2015 and 2016, when Trump was supposedly doing all these things, President Obama, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States, was saying, Russia is not our enemy. In fact, we want to partner with them in Syria, against terrorism, and elsewhere. In 2012, Mitt Romney said Russia was our enemy, and the Democrats put out a video mocking that, saying that was true in the Cold War, but in the 21st century, Russia is our partner in a whole bunch of different and important areas. So
can I ask you
never
something
get
there?
anywhere near treason. Yeah, let me just make one last point about this, Jim, because this is the other part that I think is so important. There's an irony to this, which is that when I first started writing about politics in 2005 and 2006, one of the main reasons that I stopped practicing law and started writing about politics is because I was so disturbed about the political climate in the United States. And one of the things I was most concerned about was that at the time, journalists who were revealing secrets about the war on terror were routinely being accused of being traitors, and even prosecution was commonly advocated for them. That was true of Jim and Eric Lichtbau's story exposing surveillance programs, the New York Times story exposing SWIFT, Dana Priest's story exposing black sites, and the argument at the time was these journalists are giving aid and comfort to our enemies, Al-Qaeda, by showing them how we're tracking their finances, how we're spying on their calls, how we're detaining them. And I found that argument so revolting and repellent for the reasons I just said. The irony, though, is in that case, they actually had a better argument for these reporters having committed treason because we really were at war with Al-Qaeda. There really was a congressional declaration authorizing the use of force, unlike in the case of Russia, where we're not at war with Russia. President Obama called them our partner. And so I think to even insinuate that this is a case of treason is extremely dangerous and unwise.
All right, Glenn, let's get
points
Jim.
to make, but go
Yeah,
ahead, Jim.
This, what you've just expressed, leads me back to what I have come to think about the way you write about the Trump and Russia story. I don't know if there was a New York Magazine story about you, and reading a lot of your writings, many times what you do is you criticize the political or journalistic points of view of either the writer or a politician who's talking about Trump and Russia fairly and often validly, but you don't deal with the underlying issue of the substance of the Trump and Russia case. For instance, just now, you made a valid criticism of the use of the word treason. But you didn't deal with the underlying issue of, do you believe that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election? In one of your most recent stories, you talk about this Dutch politician who's accused of lying about Putin, or who admitted he lied about Putin. But buried in that story, you say there's convincing evidence of Russian meddling, and you link to a story about the Internet Research Agency. But it's just like one passing phrase in a sentence.
That was the organization at the center
and then
of these
a few
indictments.
A few days later, they were indicted by Mueller. And so I wonder whether the way in which you write about these issues masks an acceptance of the substance of the case that you don't want to talk about.
Okay, so let me explain to you first why I began with the point about whether or not Donald Trump is a traitor is a fair question. It's because the headline on your story was this: is Donald Trump a traitor? Question mark. You then spent the first passage of your article saying that you thought that if this case could be proven, this is a textbook definition
Yeah,
of treason.
and I still believe
you
that.
Then, hold on, Jim. Hold on, Jim. You then went on MSNBC.
Pulitzer Prize winner James Risen writes in The Intercept, pointing out a stark truth about the man currently occupying the Oval Office.
You cracked the code for how to be an Intercept writer and get on MSNBC, which is to write an article entitled "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" And the graphic on the screen underneath your picture was, "Did Donald Trump commit treason?" So the reason I began my discussion of your article with this question of whether it's fair to raise the question of treason isn't because I'm trying to avoid the primary points raised by your piece. The reason I began with that is because you began with that.
Okay. Well, let me respond to let me first respond to your point about treason, which I think it is a valid question. It's a question. I didn't give an answer. I said that it's a question whether he's a traitor. I didn't say yes, he is a traitor. I said if you look at the issues of if you are a presidential candidate, you collaborate with a foreign government, an adversary. Granted, it's not an enemy of the United States, and under the legal definition of treason, that may be one reason why it will never be considered treason, as you pointed out. But the idea that if you're a presidential candidate and you get elected by colluding with an adversary of the United States, I think most Americans would think, in the common usage of that term, that would be treason. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a traitor.
But there is no definition of treason or traitor besides the legal definition.
Yeah, well, I think you're wrong about that.
I think it's a really dangerous standard.
No, I think you're wrong about. I think there's a common usage and a legal usage.
I think it's a really dangerous standard.
I said in my piece, if you recall,
to say that okay, well, maybe treason and being a traitor doesn't apply in the legal sense, but a lot of Americans think that it would apply in a colloquial sense. You know what? I can guarantee you, and I'm sure there's polling to support this, in fact, that in 2006 and in 2007, a lot of Americans believed that the New York Times was guilty of treason for exposing secrets that were designed to help Al Qaeda learn about the U.S. And so I think it's incredibly dangerous, especially for a journalist who writes about classified programs, to say, hey, when we're talking about treason and being a traitor, let's not use this careful constitutional definition. Let's just be colloquial about it and take a poll and figure out whether or not people kind of like the behavior. And if they don't like it, let's just maybe suggest someone's. That's exactly why I think it's so dangerous. And why
we can disagree on that point, but I do want to know whether or not you believe now, given the level of evidence, that there is a strong preponderance of evidence that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election.
Okay, so I think that in order to answer both of these questions, the question of whether Trump did actually collude, which I realize is not yet the subject of your story, you're reporting that's coming soon, as well as the question of whether or not the Russians intervened in the election, we need to be very specific about what it is that we're asking. So, for example, when we talk about collusion, and I want to address it this way on purpose because another thing that you said in the story was, even if he's not guilty of treason, if the collusion charges are true, think about what it means. It means that he's an agent of a foreign power.
Glenn, let's just, before you do that, let's hear Jim on MSNBC. You referenced it, so let's go to that clip of Jim.
If collusion is proven, then I think almost by definition he's a traitor. And I think everyone is afraid of the consequences of using that word because it's so fraught. But that is essentially what it is. If you collude with an adversary of the United States to take over the government of the United States, you're a traitor.
Right. So I think anyone who just reads the Constitution would know that that's not the case. But on the question of collusion, so let's ask what it is.
Wait a second. I asked you whether you believe that the Russians intervened in the election.
Jim, you can't keep interrupting me and then accusing me of not answering. Right. I can only answer if you let me speak.
We have time. We have time here for both of you guys to complete thoughts. This is not cable news.
I have a lot to say on that question. I promise you. So I'm gonna talk about that. On the question of collusion, because it relates to what I want to say about Russia. When we say, was there collusion between Trump and Russia, that might mean a lot of different things. I think what it originally meant in 2016 when the Clinton campaign was accusing Trump and his officials of being criminal, and the reason Bob Mueller was ultimately appointed, was there was a notion that Trump actually conspired with the Russians to hack into the email servers of the DNC and John Podesta. That would be a crime. That would be Trump actually working with, as a conspirator with the Russians to commit a crime. It might mean that the Russians did it on their own without Trump's knowledge, and then after the fact came to Trump and said, hey, guess what? We have some really interesting dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of these emails that we would like to give you so that you can use it against her. It might mean that they simply told Trump, hey, we want you to know we got this dirt and we're passing it to the public through WikiLeaks. It could mean any one of those things. So let's say that it meant simply that the Russians told Trump, hey, we have this dirt on Hillary Clinton that we'd like to give you. Is that, if Trump or Trump Jr. or anyone in the Trump campaign said, oh, you have dirt on our opponent, well, and you want to give it to us? Sure, we'd like to take that. Would that be a crime? Would that mean that Trump is an agent of the Russian government? The Politico has this really great story that they wrote after the election, in which they reported that Ukrainian officials met with and worked with a contractor for the DNC to give dirt about Donald Trump to the Clinton campaign. And the DNC and the Clinton campaign eagerly accepted it because, of course, you accept dirt about your political opponent no matter where it comes from. Does that mean that the Clinton campaign was an agent of the Ukrainian government or that they criminally colluded with the Ukrainian government? So the idea of collusion, to me, it's a word that doesn't actually exist in the law. And I think we have to be very careful about what it is that we mean. If all we mean is Trump Jr. was willing to accept some dirt about Hillary Clinton from the Russians, that's zillions of universes away from treason. And it also wouldn't mean that Donald Trump is an agent of the Russian government. Or anything like that. It would simply mean that he accepted help the way that the Democrats were willing to accept help from the Ukrainian officials in order to get dirt on their opponent. On the question
Wait,
of
Glenn,
whether
can we break these into pieces? Let's take the collusion and then we'll come back to you for the next one. Let's just get Jim's response on that direct issue.
I want him to answer the question that I asked him, which was, do you believe that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election to help Trump? Because let me just say one thing was, over time, your position seems to have changed dramatically. Last year, it seemed that you thought all of this was a hoax. But more recently, you seem to, as I said, in kind of throwaway lines in your pieces, accept much of the idea that the Russians intervened. At the same time, you're attacking people for making too big of a deal of it. And so to me, I am confused as a reader of you, and I think a lot of people are confused about what your basic belief now is. Do you believe that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election?
So again, I think first of all, I just want to say, it's extremely easy to characterize what someone's view is without actually quoting them or specifying where they supposedly said it, which is why I've been extremely careful whenever I've been characterizing your arguments to actually quote what it is you said. Because the idea that I ever thought or said that it was a hoax that Russia was meddling in the election is completely false. I never said anything like that. It's the same thing that I say now, which is that the lesson of the Iraq War, for sure, when it seemed like there was a whole bunch of evidence because it was appearing on the front page of the New York Times, quoting foreign officials and intelligence officials with not firsthand knowledge and all of that about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and his alliance with al-Qaeda. The lesson is that we shouldn't believe claims from the US government absent convincing evidence, meaning not anonymous sources inside of governments making assertions without underlying corroboration, but actual tangible evidence that we can see and assess for ourselves in order to make that assessment. And so when the US government came out in January of 2017 and first said that Vladimir Putin personally ordered the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta, I agreed with what Masha Gessen wrote. She, of course, is a Russian expatriate and a very hardcore critic of Putin. And she said, after months of anticipation, speculation, and hand-wringing by politicians and journalists, American intelligence agencies have finally released a declassified version of a report on the part they believe Russia played in the U.S. presidential election. A close reading of the report shows that it barely supports such a conclusion. Indeed, it barely supports any conclusion. There is not much to read. The declassified version is 25 pages, of which 2 are blank, 4 are decorative, 1 contains an explanation of terms, 1 a table of contents, and 7 are a previously published unclassified report by the CIA's open source division on RT. There is even less to process. The report adds hardly anything to what we have already knew. So my problem with this claim from the beginning was that it was unaccompanied by any evidence. I think there is now some evidence that Russia did things in the election to, and I think it's a question of what their motive is. I think the Mueller indictment contains some details about 13 Russians who apparently created some fake Facebook pages and Twitter accounts and political tweets that, in contrast to what you claimed was their motive, which was to help elect Donald Trump, the Mueller indictment says it wasn't that. It was to sow divisions within the United States, that they were also supportive of Bernie Sanders, of Jill Stein, that they were really interested in sowing division. That was the motive that they attributed to the people that they indicted.
They were trying to hurt Clinton and help Trump, and that during the primaries they were supporting opponents of Clinton.
Okay, well, people can go read it. The motive that Mueller attributes in those indictments was to actually sow divisions. I think the theory is that nobody thought Trump was going to win, that Clinton was going to win, and they wanted to weaken her. So when you ask me, do I believe now that Russia played a role in the election, or has my views changed? A, my view has never changed. My view is exactly the same, which is I'm not going to accept claims until there's evidence for them. I think there is some evidence in the form of Bob Mueller's accusations in an indictment, which are yet to be tried in court, and lots of times prosecutors' accusations are proven to be false or don't have evidence, that they did some things like putting up Facebook ads and Twitter accounts and some poorly attended political events. I still don't see any evidence, other than some anonymously leaked claims, that Vladimir Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta's emails, which, remember, was the original controversy that led to the appointment of a special counsel into this entire controversy. It wasn't about Twitter bots or Facebook page ads. It was that Vladimir Putin personally ordered and directed the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta. And part of the evidence that I actually find most persuasive is what Putin's opponents in Russia are saying. There was a great article in the Times in November. There was one in the New Yorker in July that described how Putin's liberal, pro-Western opponents in Russia are indignant over this idea that Putin is some kind of mastermind who controls everything going on in Russia. They said that that's the image that he wants to propagate, but it's the opposite of reality. There's an endless number of competing factions in Russia who do all kinds of things at cross purposes with one another. It's basically an autocratic, oligarchical mess, and not some really well-oiled machine.
Well, let me put this to both of you.
So no, I don't think that there is very convincing evidence on the core claim.
Well, I think,
that
but I think
Putin
what you've
ordered those hacking.
But
even
I think
though
what you've just
there's
said
evidence that some Russians did some social media activity.
I think what you've just said is something that is very important, which is that you've now said straight out that you think the Russians did intervene in some way in the 2016 election. And I think that many people who have read you, and I know that you this is a big issue for you because I've looked at your Twitter feed, and there's a lot of fights you have with people who interpret what you say, and you get angry at them on Twitter for accusing you of certain things. But you and I are in the communications business, and if the preponderance of what you write is interpreted by a large number of your readers in a certain way, then and it's not what you intended, then you failed as a communicator.
Well, wait, hold on.
So,
but I think that's a little bit unfair, Jim.
No. Let me
I mean,
finish.
look
Let me
at the
finish, because-
the
let me
groupthink
finish.
that goes on TV
No,
these
no,
days.
no. My only point is, I'm not talking about a groupthink. I'm talking about, have you accurately communicated what you really believe over the last year?
Totally. If you were to, let me just say.
Because you're now saying that that's always been.
The idea that if people attribute to you things that you didn't say, it means that you failed as a communicator, I think is preposterous.
No, it's not.
It might mean that the reason people are attributing to me things I never said is because I'm a poor communicator. It might be because there's an attempt to smear people who don't get on board with the prevailing orthodoxy. In 2002, opponents of the Iraq War were constantly accused of being admirers of Saddam Hussein. Were they?
My only point is that
they weren't. There's lots of motives why people attribute things to other people that aren't what they said. And if you go back and look at what I write, and I recently compiled it, from the very first moment I began writing about this story, I always said the same thing, which is actually something that you said in your own article that I agree with, which is that, of course it's possible, even plausible, that there was some attempt by the Russians to destabilize the U.S. election, because that's something that the U.S. and the Russians have been doing to one another forever. So, I mean, why would I would never put it past Putin or the Russian intelligence services, oh, they're too ethical, or oh, they're too restrained to try and disseminate division and disinformation within the American polity. That's something that these two countries have done to everybody. So it's never been the case that I've denied it or said it was a hoax.
Okay,
I
but
just
let me
wanted to
just
see
say
evidence
this.
for it as a
You
journalist.
are a very talented writer, and you are a good communicator. And you are incredibly smart. And yet you must know that over the past year, the preponderance of what you have written has been interpreted by most people who I think are reasonable readers, that you are among the people who deny the existence of the Russian involvement in the election or collusion. That is the overwhelming interpretation of what you've written by most people.
But Tim, the pushback on that is, and I want to ask you this, where is your evidence of collusion? Not in a legal term. I just mean in
I'm
what
just talking
ordinary
about
people.
the way people perceive what Glenn has written.
Yes, but I think then Glenn can rightly say to them, well, you show me the evidence. For instance, if it turns out that all of the forensic investigations that happened are actually not correct, or there's flaws in how they determine that it's Russian hackers that did this, then the whole thing goes out the window. Let me just read from Jeffrey Carr, who is not some flaming leftist here. He says, there is not now and has never been a single piece of technical evidence produced that connects the malware used in the DNC attack to the GRU, FSB, or any agency of the Russian government. Now, Jeffrey Carr may be wrong, but there is a compelling case to be made that FireEye and CrowdStrike selectively presented evidence and left out huge swaths of details that lately the AP has gone into and looked at that showed, as you mentioned earlier, a very wide canvas that the Russians were striking on that included military people working on drones. To me, the central question is, if the Russians did hack it, and they were behind the DNC, then you have an issue where they're saying, how are we going to disseminate this to achieve our political aims? But if the entire thing is based on BS, on a forensic level, then this entire conversation is almost pointless.
No, I agree with that. And I think one of the best pieces of evidence that's come out recently was something I mentioned in this story. In the Dutch media, two major news organizations in Holland wrote amazing stories about how Dutch intelligence had real-time access, hacking into the systems of the Russian hackers who were behind the DNC hack.
Well, let's just read from it. There were articles in Die Volkskrant. So their story was based on anonymous sources.
On who?
On anonymous sources. They're based on anonymous sources, as much of this reporting is, including in this country, for reasons we can debate and discuss. But just in the effort of expediency here, according to the paper, hackers from AIVD, the Dutch General Intelligence and Security Service, penetrated the network of the Russian hacker group known as Cozy Bear in the summer of 2014. Then, according to that article, Cozy Bear, which is also known as Advanced Persistent Threat 29, worked from a space in a university building near the Red Square. The Dutch hackers, this story says, didn't just watch what Cozy Bear was doing, but they were also hacked into the security camera that recorded all of the comings and goings. Just to give context, that's what Jim is talking about.
Right.
Did they? So I'm sorry. You said so. It's based on anonymous sources. No one's name is attached to those claims. Like we don't know. There's no way to know.
No, I mean they're officials from Dutch intelligence, and they, according to this Dutch story, which hasn't been contradicted since then, they passed on all their evidence to the NSA and to the U.S. intelligence community.
Did anybody reporting this story show any of this physical evidence, like any of the
I don't
pictures
know.
that
I
were
don't have
taken, or the? I haven't seen any of it. Have you?
No, I haven't.
We can go down the lane of arguing about anonymous sources and government sources. People can make up their own minds about it. The point is that this was in a major, respected newspaper, as many of the allegations against Trump are in this country, in terms of how the broader public views this, and so it is being taken seriously. There is no proof for it. It is just the allegations of officials talking to the most important publications in the Netherlands.
Exactly, and that's my point, Jeremy, is the New York Times is actually a really important, well-respected paper too. And if in 2002 we were having this debate and about whether or not Saddam had weapons of mass destruction or had an alliance with Al-Qaeda, Jim could say, and he would be 1,000% right, that look, there's these really detailed, definitive, compelling claims in highly respected papers detailing the exact nature of Saddam's weapons program and his alliance with Al-Qaeda. And I'm not saying that that means that every story that is based on anonymous sources is false. It's not. There's some really good reporting based on anonymous sources. But at the very least, I think we all have to agree, and I believe that the three of us have all agreed in the past, that one of the lessons of the Iraq War has to be that we should be highly skeptical when Western intelligence agencies make self-serving claims through the media while hiding behind a shield of anonymity and aren't offering the underlying corroborating evidence to assess it.
I agree.
So yes,
I agree completely with that. And I was at the New York Times while the WMD debacle was happening. I tried to fight it, and it was a horrible experience. And you're absolutely right to be skeptical. I've always tried to be skeptical.
Right.
In this case, I believe that you can also go too far the other way and not be open enough to facts as they emerge. And what I find compelling today is that there are a number of facts coming from a number of different sources, both in the U.S. government, outside the government, in foreign press. The Intercept has received anonymously documents that the government didn't want us to have, that all point to a fairly strong conclusion that the Russians intervened in the election. I don't believe that there is the same level of evidence to prove collusion. I don't think we're anywhere close to proving collusion yet.
But Jim, let's say that we allow, or we all, just for the sake of argument, agree that the Russians spent money on social media campaigns that were aimed at trying to stop Hillary Clinton from becoming president. Let's say that we all take that on its surface. Let's also say that we take on its surface that Russia was behind the hacking of the DNC and the dissemination of those emails. But there is no evidence that links Trump to any involvement in this. Isn't that
into the original hack?
Right, into the original hack. I mean, everybody uses opposition research that's gained in all sorts of dirty ways. But isn't the whole point here? Doesn't the entire thing rest on the idea that Trump participated in this, or that senior Trump people did? And there's a lot of lies that are suspicious, and I want to ask Glenn about some of that.
Right.
But to ask you, Jim, isn't it necessary to show that they actually participated in a criminal conspiracy?
Yes, I agree with that. And
there isn't any evidence of that right now.
To me, we're at phase one in my reporting is trying to get even more fundamental. Did the Russians do anything Did they intervene? Because if that's not true, then everything else falls apart, including
But
collusion.
let's say we all agree on
okay,
that. Now,
all right,
what do you
all
do
right.
with the fact that there isn't anything linking Trump in them?
To me, that's the big hole in the whole story. I think there is fairly strong evidence that the Russians intervened in some way in the election. Whether it made much of a difference in the election is, to me, a different question. The other part that I think is fairly clear is that Trump and the people around him have engaged in some form of effort to impede the Mueller investigation or to impede federal investigations into what happened. The Comey firing and a number of other things all lead to the suggestion that you might be able to build some kind of a case of obstruction.
Well, in fact, you've said that is one perfectly plausible scenario, that none of the underlying allegations are proven in court, but that several people, if not many people, end up going down on charges that they obstructed justice or they lied to federal investigators.
And that's a very typical thing to happen in Washington scandals, like in Iran-Contra or things like that. You know, people go to jail for lying to the FBI, or not for some underlying crime. And so that's, to me, that could be where we end up. I think collusion is going to be very difficult to prove. And I don't claim that the proof is there. I think there's a lot of interesting evidence, and there's a lot of things to continue to investigate. But I don't think we're there yet, and we may never get there. I'm not sure it exists.
Glenn, how do you then reckon with the fact that it seems like key people around Trump have repeatedly lied, including about very significant episodes that are in the spotlight right now, and that the president himself is regularly lying in a demonstrable way on Twitter? Doesn't it strike you as a bit odd that they all seem to be constantly sort of lying about any contacts with Russians whatsoever?
No, it doesn't strike me as odd at all that Donald Trump and his closest aides and advisors are pathological liars. I would expect nothing less. I think Trump has always been that. If you talk to anybody in New York real estate or in banking or in Atlantic City who has dealt with him in any capacity, they will all tell you that that's what he and everybody around him is and has always been. So I want to address that in 1 second, but I just want to address this kind of overarching point first, like the kind of atmospheric journalism point about this idea that, well, there's been a focus on when media outlets get stories wrong, like the Washington Post says the Russians hacked the electric system, or the Dutch foreign minister, or that lied about his meeting with Putin, in which Putin said that Greater Russia includes Ukraine and Belarus and other former Soviet states. I think it matters a lot that we not succumb to this idea that it's okay to serve this kind of broader truth by getting lots of things wrong along the way. That's the concept that Stephen Colbert in the Bush era mocked as truthiness. Yeah, we're saying false things, but it's in service of this bigger truth. And I think it is really dangerous when you have two nuclear armed powers who have almost annihilated this species on several occasions, who still have Cold War nuclear war systems in place, to heighten tension through bad reporting, through falsehoods, through lies. I think it fuels Trump's attacks on the media. I think it sows distrust in journalism. And I think it's a really important role for journalists to play to say what this official said is untrue. What that media outlet reported was reckless and wrong and misled a lot of people. And to do that doesn't mean that I or other people who are doing it are saying there's nothing there. What we're saying is we ought to be journalistically faithful to the facts and not be inflammatory and reckless. And I think it matters when people in positions of power and influence get things really wrong. On the question of Trump lying, sometimes people lie to cover up crimes. Many other times they lie for other reasons besides covering up crimes. And I think there's no question Trump and lots of people close to Trump have repeatedly lied about the core questions of this case. They're meeting with Russian officials and a whole bunch of other related issues. But think about it. When Trump got elected and the allegations of the Democrats was that he colluded with the Russians or that the Russians helped him, he's very sensitive about that because it threatens the legitimacy of his win. It could be just for political reasons they wanted to minimize their contacts with the Russians because they think it's politically harmful if they're seen as dealing too much with the Russians. So I could see them easily reflexively lying in order to protect themselves from political harm. That's just as plausible to me as that they're lying continuously in order to cover up underlying crimes, for which I think we're all in basic agreement that there's not very much evidence, at least as of yet.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the point you made. I agree with you that it's really valuable for you to write about the media on these issues and to call them to account. And I think that's valuable. I'm not suggesting that it's not. What I'm suggesting is that for the most part, that's been the way that you have dealt with this story. And I find it difficult to find a place in your reporting where you just straight out laid out what you really believe about the case.
That's because my views of what happened are always going to be based on the available evidence. And thus far, I think the available evidence has been extremely weak to non-existent. It's non-existent on whether Putin specifically ordered this. It's extremely weak to non-existent on whether the Russian government actually did the hacking of the Podesta and the DNC emails. I think there's some evidence now that they were active in doing fake social media accounts, whether how linked they were to the government, how centralized that were. I think those are all open questions. So I don't think that journalism only means making affirmative claims based on shoddy evidence.
Well, but Glenn,
it's a really important journalistic service to say there's no evidence for these claims and therefore we shouldn't believe them yet. And that is the position that I've taken from the start.
Now, Glenn, you fairly regularly now appear on Fox News.
Did Putin get Trump elected? We still don't know. We did recently speak, though, to progressive journalist Glenn Greenwald, who said the press is replacing good reporting with inaccurate scandal mongering.
We can talk about why that is and the strategy involved there. I will say, in fairness, I know that you are not exactly having your door banged down by MSNBC to be on these days. But I don't want to get yet into the issue of Fox News, but I do want to play a clip of something that you said on Laura Ingram's show last December. Let's listen.
If people were just making mistakes journalistically because they were rushing or because human beings are fallible, as we all are, you would expect roughly 50% of the mistakes to go in one direction and 50% of the mistakes to go in the other direction. And what you're seeing in this story is the exact opposite. Virtually 100% of the mistakes that outlets like CNN and the Washington Post and MSNBC make are designed to undermine and subvert Donald Trump and to bolster the Russia-Trump story, just like all of Fox's mistakes are in the opposite direction.
Go ahead,
Okay,
respond.
so let's then do a kind of thought experiment, okay? Let's say you were me, and your view of this story is what I myself have said from the start it is, which is that as journalists and as citizens, we shouldn't believe claims until there's evidence furnished to prove that those claims are true, convincing evidence. Thus far, with regard to the accusations that Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta's emails, there is very little to no actual convincing evidence that that's true, and therefore we shouldn't believe that that claim is true. What you call a caveat is actually a really important part of what I think, which is that, of course, it's possible that Putin did it. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But as a journalist, I don't think it matters what I believe, as though I'm some kind of like a medium, psychically intuiting what actually happened. I think that my role as a journalist is supposed to be to evaluate convincing evidence and then report to my readers what it is that happened based not on my beliefs, but on the actual evidence.
Well, have you done any reporting on this?
Yeah, I think it is reporting, Jim, to say that there's the evidence that's being offered by the United States government is extremely unconvincing. One of my journalistic heroes, another one of them, is Izzy Stone, who basically did that all the time. That's what he did. He got reporting from mainstream media. He compared it to what the actual evidence was that they were citing, and then he highlighted all of the huge holes in what the actual evidence was that was being cited by the government and the media to demonstrate why the claims were extremely unpersuasive. That is journalism. That is a really
No, that's fine.
important
I'm just saying,
function.
I come away from reading what you've written confused. And
What are you confused about? Let's clarify it now.
I'm confused by what you really, by what you're trying to say. frankly. I'm confused.
I'm trying to say that as rational citizens and good journalists, we should not believe claims from the U.S. government about things that happened, especially inflammatory claims about their adversaries, absent convincing evidence that we can assess and review rationally. And that with regard to the core claims of the Russia-Trump story, the core claims that from the beginning have spawned the controversy, namely that Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC and Podesta email inboxes, there is little to no convincing evidence that that's true.
Well, I think
I've always said there should be a full investigation, which is what I really want to happen, where all of this evidence is put forth in a way that we don't have to rely on anonymous leaks and little snippets and self-serving people leaking certain parts for whatever their agenda is that we can't really assess, that we should actually one day be able to see all of the evidence so that we know what really happened here. But until such time, we should be skeptical about these claims.
I agree with
then
that.
the other
I
part
agree.
Of my,
I-
okay,
I-
well,
I
that's,
have-
that's my view.
I
So don't
agree
see why you're
with
confused.
skepticism of the intelligence community. I think my career speaks to that.
I agree. It does. I think that one of the issues with our difference here is that in general, and it's a virtue of your national security reporting, you tend to stay away from politics. And I think that you are severely underestimating the political strain that runs through how people perceive this story, the extreme importance that Democrats have placed in believing that this Russia story is true, because it helps them explain a very disorienting and complicated set of events that led to someone like Donald Trump being elected president. It excuses the failures of their own party because they get to place the blame on a foreign villain instead of accepting it for themselves. And it makes it a really important political tactic in 2018 and 2020 to say that Donald Trump aided and abetted the Russians.
Well, and
so
also, Glenn, just quickly, small detail about this. Jim, the night you were on Chris Hayes' show on MSNBC, two guests on that program that night compared what we know about Russian interference or allegations of Russian interference to the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
This is a very serious attack against the United States by a hostile foreign power, an attack against our election process. Imagine if FDR had denied that the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor and didn't react. That's the equivalent.
I do think this is equivalent of Pearl Harbor.
You have an enormous amount of exaggeration and very sweeping declarations about how serious this is in the context of American history that just fall apart if you examine the underlying.
I agree with that.
Let Glenn finish this.
So I think that number one is, I don't think you should underestimate. There definitely are good faith critics of my reporting. I think you're one, which is why I've taken an hour and however many minutes of my day debating this with you. But please do not underestimate the extent to which there are political operatives and highly partisan people who are looking to construe what I've said in the least generous light possible.
Fair enough.
Because politically, it's very important for them to discredit me as one of the people who has been most vocal in expressing skepticism about these stories.
But Glenn, you go on Fox News to do it.
I go on Democracy Now! To do it.
Yeah,
I go on CNN
no, I know,
to do it.
but let's not compare. Fox News is an absolute lie factory. It was before this, and it will be after it. Now, I've joined you in all of the criticism of MSNBC and CNN, but just to put out personally where I stand on this, I wouldn't go on Fox News unless a big part of my point was going after and attacking Fox News. This is a strategic difference you and I have. Yes, you've done it at times. You did it on Laura Ingram's show. But a lot of the times when you're on Tucker Carlson's show, Glenn, and he is, I think he is one of the more rabid and dangerous people, particularly on issues of race in this country. You go on his show and you do not make it a point to go after him for those things that filter into what is actually going on in this country and what we should be standing in opposition to. So I find that curious.
Jeremy, you know what? Because Jeremy, you know what? I'm not a performing monkey who goes on to TV to entertain people or to prove a point to them. If I go on a TV program, for example, you go on Bill Maher and have gone on Bill Maher continuously. The last time you said you weren't going to go on because Milo was on, but before that you went on all the time with him, even though he's incredibly bigoted and racist and horrible in all kinds of ways. presume you do that because you believe that the things you're saying are important and you want to have a platform and reach the most number of people that you can in order to do them. So if I go on a TV program and a host asks me a question about my views, I'm going to answer them truthfully and not calculate, let me try and go out of my way to prove to good liberals that I'm not really a Fox conservative. My view, I've spoken at the Cato Institute, I've spoken at Marxist conventions. My view has always been that if you believe in the things that you're saying and you think they're important, you should go to as many people as possible and as many platforms as possible in order to be heard and try and persuade people of what it is that you're saying. And just to address that last point that Jim made, I do think that the thing that Jeremy just said is the thing underlying this most for me, Jim, which is that there is this heightened war rhetoric. Now, when you have Democrats comparing what the Russians did to 9/11, which led to 17 years of endless war and an erosion of civil liberties, and World War and Pearl Harbor, which led to the nuking of Japan, I think the rhetoric is getting really dangerous.
No,
and so a big part of what I've done is try and rein that in out of concern that we're just going to unintentionally end up in a new Cold War.
I think that gets to the heart of the difference in how you and I approach this story. And I am trying to approach it journalistically. I've been a reporter all my life. This is the first time I've been a columnist, really. And so I'm trying to do it based on, what is this as a story, a news story? And I think you, as an advocate, with your background in advocacy, I think you approach it as a political question. I think you're looking at it as a political problem that has a lot of political consequences for the country. And it certainly does, but that's a different approach to the way I'm trying to look at it. I'm just trying to do this. Is this a really good story? Yes, it's a good news story. And I think you see it as this is a political threat to the way in which your political agenda, which is a very valid way to look at it. It's just different from mine.
I do see it that way, but I also think I see it journalistically and have tried to look at it through a journalistic lens, which is let's not accept claims without evidence. To me, that is the core of journalism.
No, I
totally agree.
Yeah.
And I totally agree that I see a political angle to it, and that it's been important to me, that political angle. But it's also been an evidentiary one that I think that so many media outlets have gone wrong with.
My point is, I think I told you at the beginning, I didn't really get into this story until recently. And it's only because I see the potential gravity of it, and not real. It hasn't had a real large historical significance yet, but it has the potential to be that, and I think that's why it's an important issue.
Well, I know I'm going to be looking forward to reading the next article in Jim Risen's series, and also, Glenn, your coming journalism as well. Needless to say, folks, The Intercept is a very interesting place to be working right about now. Glenn Greenwald gets paid in rubles. Jim Risen gets paid in suitcases of cash from the CIA. Just wanted to make sure we got that all on the record. Jim Risen, thanks so much for doing this today.
Thanks.
Glenn, thank you from Rio de Janeiro.
All right, guys.
All right.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Take care. And thank you, everyone, for watching and listening.